Most cities begin with a promise. A river that can be crossed, a coastline that can be defended, a flat plain where roads can spread like veins. But there are places on Earth where the land offers no such deal. The ground is not stable. The air is too thin. The slope is too steep. The water keeps arriving, whether you invited it or not. In those locations, a city is not a natural outcome of geography. It is a decision, repeated over centuries, enforced by engineering, logistics, and routine. Tonight, we are going to follow that decision across the globe, not to chase pretty skylines, but to study the obstacles beneath them. Because when a city is built in an impossible place, everything you take for granted gets rewritten. The streets, the foundations, the commute, even how the city protects itself from its own environment. Start high above sea level, where the atmosphere itself becomes a design constraint. In Bolivia, the La Paz and El Alto metro area occupies one of the highest major urban regions on Earth. La Paz sits in a steep bowl, while El Alto spreads across the plateau above it, and the two are separated by a sharp rise that turns a few miles away into a slow climb on winding roads. That cliff of elevation used to trap commuters in traffic, because cars and buses have to follow the contours of the land. Then the city solved the problem by going into the sky. Mi Teleférico, the urban cable car network, was built as public transit instead of as a tourist ride. It runs on multiple lines with dozens of stations, cabins arriving seconds apart, and a total system length measured in tens of kilometers. The key advantage is simple. The gondolas ignore congestion and climb the slope directly, stitching together neighborhoods that sit hundreds of meters apart vertically. When terrain is the main enemy, vertical transit becomes as important as a freeway. Altitude does more than reshape transportation. It changes how bodies and machines behave. At around 3,600 to 4,000 meters, there is noticeably less oxygen available in each breath, which is why visitors can feel headaches or fatigue before their blood chemistry adapts. That matters for everything from construction schedules to how quickly emergency crews can move up stair-heavy streets. If you have ever felt winded walking up a stadium ramp at sea level, imagine doing that in a city where the air never gives you the full amount you're used to. The landscape forces a slower rhythm, and the city learns to work within it. Now trade thin air for steep land, because there are cities where the problem is not oxygen, it is gravity. Hong Kong is one of the clearest examples of a modern metropolis built against a hillside. Parts of the city rise so sharply that the simplest trip from a train station to an apartment can feel like a hike. Roads cannot always take a straight line, and there is not enough flat space to just build a bigger street the way a sprawling American city might. So Hong Kong built a mechanical shortcut into its daily life. The central to mid-levels escalator and walkway system runs for about 800 meters and climbs roughly 135 meters in elevation. It is covered because heavy rain and humidity are normal here, and it functions as a commuter artery, not a novelty. The full ride can take around 20 minutes, which tells you something important. This is a city where the commute is not only horizontal, it is vertical. Pause on what that implies. When a city is steep, distance has two numbers: how far and how high. Delivery routes, school commutes, and even where businesses cluster are shaped by grade. In the United States, we usually describe traffic in miles and minutes. In a hillside city, the elevation change becomes part of the cost of living. The built environment responds with stair streets, elevated walkways, and systems like these escalators that turn cliffs into corridors. Some cities face a different kind of uphill battle. Not a slope, but a foundation that cannot be trusted. Mexico City is famous for being built on the remains of an ancient lake system. Over time, heavy pumping of groundwater and the natural compaction of soft sediments have contributed to subsidence, meaning parts of the city are sinking. This is not a slow, geological whisper. In some areas, the sinking has been measured in the range of tens of centimeters per year, with reporting that the city can subside at rates approaching about 50 centimeters per year in the worst affected zones. If you live on stable ground, it is hard to imagine what that does to infrastructure. Water pipes crack because the ground drops unevenly. Streets tilt. Building foundations can distort. Drainage systems that once relied on gravity can stop working as designed because the slope of the city changes beneath them. The impossible place here is not a mountain or a desert. It is a surface that behaves like a slow-moving material under the weight of a megacity. Mexico City has had to engineer around a ground plane that refuses to stay flat. Cross the ocean to another sinking city problem with even more urgency. Jakarta, on the north coast of Java. Parts of the region have experienced serious land subsidence, and the combination of sinking ground, coastal flooding, and rising sea levels has pushed massive flood defense plans, including proposals for large seawall projects along the north coast. Reports have described subsidence in Jakarta in striking terms, with figures reaching up to about 10 inches a year in some discussions of the crisis. Whether you focus on the exact number or the lived reality, the mechanism is the same. When groundwater is extracted and soft sediments compact, the land drops and the sea does not care why. In the United States, coastal cities worry about storm surge during hurricanes. Jakarta has to think about something more constant, the baseline itself shifting downward. When that happens, a once-in-a-decade flood pattern can become a frequent event because the city is slowly lowering into the waterline. That is what makes this kind of geography so brutal. It is not one disaster you rebuild from. It is a moving target. Water creates one more category of impossible, and Venice is the classic case. Venice is not a city placed beside water. It is a city distributed across islands inside a lagoon, connected by bridges and canals. In other words, the street network is partially liquid. This is an urban form that forces a different logistics chain because boats do what trucks do elsewhere. Venice also sits at the mercy of tides and storm-driven high water. Over time, the threat of severe flooding pushed the city toward one of the most dramatic pieces of infrastructure in Europe, the Meuse flood barrier system. Meuse consists of 78 mobile gates installed at the lagoon inlets. Under normal conditions, the gates rest out of sight. When damaging high tides are forecast, compressed air is used to push water out of the gates, making them rotate upward on hinges to form a temporary seawall. The system is described as requiring about 30 minutes to raise and roughly 15 minutes to lower back into housing. Notice how different that is from most coastal defenses. Seawalls and levees are usually permanent lines in the landscape. Venice uses something closer to a switch. The city can open and close itself, temporarily changing the boundary between lagoon and ocean. The impossible place is not only built, it is actively managed with procedures, forecasts, and operating windows, like an airport runway system, except the planes are tides. Now turn toward cold, because some cities are built on ground that is not soil in the ordinary sense. Norilsk in Russia is one of the largest cities located in a permafrost region, meaning the ground can remain frozen year-round. In permafrost engineering, the core danger is heat. Buildings can warm the soil beneath them. If ice within the ground melts, the soil can settle unevenly and foundations can shift. That is why in many northern construction contexts, foundations are commonly installed on piles, elevating structures and helping preserve the thermal stability of the frozen ground below. You are not just building a city, you are trying not to melt the platform it sits on. In a place like that, utilities often take on a visible form. Above-ground piping is not just a quirk, it can be a practical response, because digging, maintaining, and repairing buried pipes in frozen ground adds complexity. The climate forces the city's bloodstream to run where it can be accessed and protected. Longyearbyen, on Norway's Svalbard archipelago, sits even farther into that cold reality. The town is built in a permafrost zone, and for decades its cemetery accepted limited burials. Popular media often exaggerates this into the claim that it's illegal to die there, but the more accurate picture is policy and practicality. Permafrost makes traditional burial difficult, and historical fears about preservation of pathogens were part of the public conversation, even as later reporting notes that some of those fears have been tested and discussed as unfounded in scientific terms. What matters for our story is the mechanism. Cold can preserve. Frozen ground changes how remains decompose, how cemeteries function, and how a community plans end-of-life logistics in a remote place. If you've never thought about cemeteries as infrastructure, this is the moment to see it. A city is not just roads and buildings. It is also the systems that quietly handle the parts of life most people do not want to schedule. Heat can be just as controlling as cold, and the desert gives us a city that responded by going underground. Coober Pedy in South Australia is famous for dugouts, homes carved below the surface. The logic is simple physics. Underground spaces can maintain far more stable temperatures than the surface in extreme climates. Local descriptions note that these underground rooms can stay in a comfortable range around 23 to 25 degrees Celsius day and night through the year. NASA's Earth Observatory has described similar stability in these subterranean spaces, explaining that passive cooling and ventilation shafts help manage heat and moisture. Think of what that means for energy. In many American cities, air conditioning is a major summer expense and a major grid load. Coober Pete's underground architecture turns the surrounding rock into a thermal buffer. The city's impossible place is not that it cannot be occupied. It is that surface living becomes punishing enough that the most reasonable architecture is to remove yourself from the surface entirely. Streets stay above ground. Much of life moves below. Rock creates another kind of shelter that cities can exploit, and one of the most striking examples is Setenil de las Bodegas in Spain. This town is known for dwellings built into and under rock formations along the river, using natural overhangs as literal roofs. It is not a theme park trick. It is a practical use of geology. Overhangs provide shade and protection from weather, and carving or building into rock can moderate interior temperatures compared to exposed walls under a hot sun. When the rock already forms half a building, you can finish the other half with masonry and doors. This is what impossible can mean on a human scale. It does not always require mega projects like flood barriers. Sometimes it is a town solving the same problem people have always faced: how to create shelter with minimal materials in a landscape that punishes exposed construction. At this point, you might notice a pattern. The most impossible cities are not reckless. They are precise. They survive by respecting constraints so strictly that the place becomes livable. A cable car network that turns cliffs into commutes. A covered escalator system that treats elevation as part of the street grid. Floodgates that can be raised on a forecast and lowered on schedule. Pile foundations that keep heat from destabilizing frozen ground. Underground homes that use rock as insulation instead of fighting the sun with electricity. Here is the sharper way to put it. In a typical city, nature is background. In these cities, nature is a constant negotiation partner. Miss a detail and the environment will invoice you later, with cracked pipes, flooded streets, shifting foundations, or dangerous heat. Look back at Mexico City for a second, because it shows the long-term consequences. Subsidence does not come with a cinematic moment. There is no single day when the ground fails. Instead, it turns infrastructure into a moving puzzle. You are always upgrading, reinforcing, rerouting. The city becomes a maintenance machine. Jakarta faces the same style of problem, but with the ocean waiting at the edge. Defensive infrastructure is not only about storms, it is about the baseline relationship between land and sea, and what happens when that relationship changes year after year. Venice sits at the intersection of those forces in a different way. It has always lived with tides. What changed was the scale of risk and the willingness to install moving barriers as part of routine city operations. A few degrees matter. Frozen ground is not a static platform. It is a condition that must be protected. Even the idea of digging a hole becomes different when the hole is cut into a material that never fully thaws. And in Coober Pedy, the most practical answer to heat was not higher technology. It was a change in geometry. If the surface is hostile, stop using the surface. So when people say a city is built in an impossible place, what they really mean is that the environment has been placed into the city's operating system. The landscape is not a postcard. It is a set of constraints that reach into architecture, transit, water, health, maintenance schedules, and sometimes even the rules of daily life. If you want a final test of this idea, think like an engineer for 10 seconds. Remove one key adaptation from each place. Take away the cable cars and force La Paz and El Alto back onto slow mountain roads. Shut down the escalator network in Hong Kong and watch hills turn short trips into barriers. Disable Venice's floodgates and let the tide draw the city's boundary for you. Ignore permafrost fundamentals and build as if Norilsk were on warm soil. Seal the ventilation shafts in Coober Pedy and try to live through desert summer with no passive cooling. The impossible place does not forgive missing pieces. That is the difference. In many cities, a system can fail and life continues, just slower. In these cities, the system is the reason the city exists at all. By the time you finish this video, I want you to see maps differently. A dot on a map is never just a dot. It is a bargain with the land, the waterline, the temperature, the slope, the soil. Some places demanded a small bargain, and the city grew naturally. Other places demanded constant payment, and people paid anyway. Because trade routes mattered, resources mattered, history mattered, or simply because communities refused to leave. Support this channel by subscribing, commenting, and liking. Thank you for watching.